Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's webcast, How Blockchain Can Help IoT Deliver ROI. I'm Rachel Brownell, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You may also download a copy of the slides and see the other interviews by clicking on the Attachments button below your presentation window. If at any time you experience technical problems, please visit our help guide by clicking on the help link in the Rate This box. You can participate at any time in the Q&A session. Just type your question into the Ask a Question text box below the video window and then click the Ask a Question button. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers. Now on to the presentation, How Blockchain Can Help IoT Deliver ROI, brought to you by VentureBeat. Discussing today's topic are Jonathan Johnson, President of Medici Ventures and Board Member for Overstock.com, Bob Kane, CEO of Luna DNA, and Jessica Grootman, Industry Analyst and Founder, Kaleido Insights. Jessica, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to everyone who is joining us today. I'm Jessica Grootman. We have a wonderful webinar in store for you. Thanks to VentureBeat as well. Before we jump in, I want to tee up a quick poll question that you can feel free to answer throughout the webinar. So we are asking right at the outset here, when do you think blockchain will become mainstream? So please cast your vote down in the portal of the webinar tool, and we'll check back in on that in about 20 or 30 minutes. So without further ado, what would be wonderful is to go around and Jonathan and Bob, introduce yourselves. I'll do the same, and then we'll dive into a gentle overview of blockchain to get everyone on the same page. Jonathan, do you want to begin?
Thanks, Jessica. I am with Overstock.com, which 4.5 years ago became the first major retailer to accept Bitcoin as a form of payment. We now accept 50 different types of cryptocurrencies as a form of payment. Shortly after doing that, we realized that the real magic with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency was the underlying technology, blockchain. And so Overstock set up a venture capital / incubator arm called Medici Ventures, and we help advance and nurture companies that are using blockchain technology in different industries. And to date, we have 12 different portfolio companies that are using blockchain technology in meaningful ways. So I'm eager to discuss blockchain, IoT, and of course, return on investment.
Excellent. Bob?
Hi, I'm Bob Kane. I've spent the last few decades in genomics, the last 15 of them working at Illumina as Chief Engineering Officer. Much of that time was spent trying to make genomic information economically available at scale. We achieved that about 5 years ago, and as you can see, genomic information now is readily available, whether it's for pre-diagnostic testing or for trying to figure out trait detection. You know, 23andMe has about 5 million members in its database. But what we realized 5 years ago is that the ability to take that information and drive discovery of the links between genomics and our health and well-being was moving very slowly. A lot of that has to do with privacy, security, and trust. And that's what brings us to where we are today. I helped co-found Luna DNA last year. I'm the CEO of Luna DNA. And the idea is that we believe that your genomic information and your medical information is really owned by you, and it needs to be controlled by you. And so we set about trying to figure out how to set up a community-owned database that can be used securely to enable discovery. And so what we are doing is we're building this database, and we have a model around the community decentralized, in a decentralized way, owning the database. And that's really what brought me to blockchain, because blockchain enables uniquely our ability to make this happen.
Fascinating to hear entry points from, traditional retail, e-commerce, as well as healthcare. I think we think of blockchain often in the financial or even just crypto realm, but really it's impacting every industry. A little bit about me, I'm an industry analyst, founding partner with Kaleido Insights. We're a research and advisory firm. We help companies with innovation strategy, but we take an approach that looks at many different technologies. Very often companies are either dazzled by a bright, shiny object rolling by. Blockchain is certainly a buzzword du jour. But it's, our take is it's not just what's your IoT strategy, what is your AI strategy, what is your blockchain strategy, what is your fill-in-the-blank strategy, but rather that these technologies are all influencing each other's development and really based on a myriad of different impacts. So we study these convergences to help companies kind of navigate all of these technologies and keep up when they're all happening at the same time. This webinar is also based on some new research that we published on this topic. The specific convergence I'm very interested in, someone who's been covering IoT for many years, is where blockchain and IoT come together. So we'll be talking about that today. But without further ado, let's get into what is blockchain. I think it's important to sort of set a base level, ask different people and get different answers. And one of the struggles is that you've probably heard of blockchain and probably Bitcoin, but what about Litecoin and Ethereum and altcoins and dApps and ICOs and permissioned and private blockchain? There are so many different terms. Once you kind of get your feet wet with this technology, it can become very, very overwhelming. So the way that we think about it is really as simple as possible, looking at, okay, what is this technology? It's a decentralized distributed ledger. I always pause on ledger because this is an important term that, other than accountants, not many people knew before this world, before blockchain came about. It's a record-keeping system. It's a database, if you like, a shared database. We're not just sharing the record, we're sharing the record-keeping system. Wherein transactions are verified. And an important caveat, I think, when defining blockchain around transactions is that it's not just monetary transactions. An effective transaction is an event taking place. It can be someone accessing a medical record. It can be someone casting a vote. It can be an object registering itself to a network. It is simply a predefined event taking place that we call transactions. So verified by and immutably recorded across an entire network, not a central authority. And this is, I think, kind of the core technical differentiation from what we have had thus far with centralized databases. Once everyone in this network that each owns a copy of the record agrees that the transaction has taken place, it becomes immutable. Blockchains today are append-only technologies. So this really, for the first time, gives us a digital proof, a digital record that something has taken place, that a person is who they say they are, or a device is who it says it is. And again, everyone in the network sort of owns or has access to this shared truth, which means that there's no single point of failure. This is another important differentiation. We don't have single honeypots full of sensitive data, but rather multiple proofs that a transaction has taken place or that this data exists. May very well not be the data itself sort of living or existing on the blockchain. So let's take a deep breath. That's probably an important part of defining blockchain. I also want to turn it over to the panelists. There's a lot of nuances around this technology. What would you all fill in? What are we missing? Any other points that you would define around blockchain?
Jessica, if I could, I would say
Please.
That I think blockchain will do for the transfer or transaction of assets, and I use that term broadly, what the internet did for the transfer of information. The internet made the transfer of information nearly free and frictionless. Blockchain, but what the internet can't do is sure that you are getting, with the internet, you get a copy of something. If I send you an email or a web page or whatever, you're getting a copy. When we're transferring assets, whether that's money or title or a vote or something along those lines, we don't want a copy. We want the transfer of the real McCoy. And that's what blockchain technology does with the distributed ledger network. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Yeah, hi, this is Bob. I would only add that one of the things that you're alluding to in these conversations is the idea of smart contracts, these automated contracts that control transactions that once they're put in place, individuals can trust that the transactions will occur as defined by the contract.
Yeah, this is an incredibly important point. It means that rules can be encoded. And this is also one of the challenges in designing the technology is sort of getting all of the different entities in a given space or context or use case to agree on those rules. But it also means that there's selective transparency. Who has access to what data based on what parameters? All of that becomes encoded. And today we have, we may have these data sets, we may have individual partnerships, but we often rely on intermediaries, third parties to reconcile that information. And so in effect, smart contracts help to sort of automate or encode that reconciliation. I think that's kind of a core difference of the technology. I also think it's important not just to define, but to demystify blockchain. If you can see the screen, you might feel like this often when you start to sink your teeth into the tech. But a few points around just sort of what we're dealing with. Blockchain can also be thought of a kind of Kleenex, in that it's a recognizable brand, or not a brand as in a company owned, but a type of distributed ledger technology. As the technology is evolving and maturing, there are different configurations, different architectures, different designs that are starting to crop up to address some of these issues that you may have heard of around power consumption, around scalability, security, privacy. So blockchain is a chain of blocks, as supports the Bitcoin blockchain, is actually just one kind of distributed ledger technology. And even within that, there are actually modules. We actually think of blockchain as a collection of modules that different companies or entities might pick off different pieces. So for example, there are different types of consensus models. There are different types of identity authentication models, different types of built-in assets, different ways to distribute transactions. So think of blockchain not as kind of a single entity. Also, there's a tremendous amount of buzz, certainly in the crypto space, around tokens. Not all blockchains necessarily need token economies. They also can be separated out as almost a module or a component to incentivize behavior. I also think it's important for businesses especially to remember that experimentation with this technology is not like other technologies. Gone are the days of experimenting, in the back room with just setting up a Twitter account, for example. This is a technology that requires many different parties to collaborate, especially at the enterprise level. If you look at an example in say, supply chain or loyalty, this is requiring multiple companies come together and help design those rules that we're encoding into the chain, as well as, what are the regulatory issues? What are the compliance issues? What are, business governance issues? How do we create shared models of liability? This really isn't something, given the inherent network effect and network role of this technology, that can be done alone. And finally, it's always important, we're in the very early days. I always say we're in the embryonic days of blockchain, and I think it's incredibly exciting. It's difficult to wrap your head around, and I think when I say blockchain, it's like half the audience gets really excited and the other half kind of glazes over. and we'll see, I think, the narrative shift in this space because it's very, very early days for understanding, for sort of mass awareness, for the technology itself. So with that, being early days, and as you all are innovators in the space, I would love to ask, where are some of the investments going? Jonathan, I know you all have invested in a number of different companies across a variety of use cases. And Bob, I love what you're working on the healthcare and giving patients and end user control of their data. Would love to hear of where precisely the investments and the experimentation is occurring.
Bob, why don't you go first?
Sure. I will talk generally about our industry and not specifically about LunaDNA's model because I think it's easier. And so where the investments are occurring is people are using blockchain to help store individuals' data and control access to individuals' data. Now, blockchain is transparent, so the data needs to be stored in an encrypted manner, but the transparency enables you to be very clear about who is accessing your data. So with the smart contracts comes the ability for an individual to have a private key, and because it's decentralized, only the individual has that private key. So when somebody wants to access your data, it really requires you to use your private key to enable that access. And because blockchain is transparent, you'll know when it is occurring and what that data is then being used for. And so it gives granular consent capability. The other aspect in our industry and others is to use the cryptocurrency as a fundraising mechanism. And it's a little bit more complicated, but a really interesting way of raising funds prior to establishing your business. I would just caution right now that the SEC has stepped in to understand how to regulate this industry. And so a lot is going to be changing in the next 6 to 9 months, but it is a very attractive area to keep an eye on.
Bob, I love that answer, and I think you've mentioned some great places to be investing and experimenting. At Medici Ventures, we're really looking at areas where there can be intermediary disruption. Today, when we transfer assets, we usually rely on trust intermediaries, whether that's banks or brokers or governments. We think blockchain removes those through trust through technology. And so the industries that we have focused on to date include capital markets, like the stock market, where if you and I are buying and selling shares, we're dealing with a broker, a prime broker, a clearing corporation. There are so many intermediaries in between the buyer and the seller. We're investing in money in banking. We're investing in the transfer of land and property title. One of our more recent investments, and it's exciting for us, is in the area of voting. You know, when I give my asset of my vote, I rely on trust intermediaries like the county clerk, like the voting machine, like the U.S. Postal Service if I'm voting by mail. We think blockchain technology gets around that. And then the area where I think blockchain technology will be particularly disruptive and innovative is in identity. The ability for individuals to own their own sovereign identity, to control what they give to people in small pieces, and for those, and once it's given, to be able to track what others do with our identity is really important. So we think that blockchain technology can be very disruptive, very innovative in areas where there are trust intermediaries between people exchanging assets.
Yeah. It's much more than just Bitcoin, right? I think a lot of people are coming in, and many enter into the crypto side, but quickly see that it's far more about asset transfer, where asset is far more than just currency. I want to get into the IoT side, and I'll present a little bit of the research that we published, which is made available to you all, both in the webinar and on our website. But it really looks at where the technology is converging, where the technologies are converging. So what does it look like to put sensor data and devices onto a blockchain or into a distributed ledger context? And when we set out to do this research, we had a look at, where are we in the IoT space? And for those of us working in the space, it's an exciting space, and certainly there are, over 8.6 billion devices deployed across every industry, from agriculture to automotive to smart homes and buildings and cities. We're connecting all sorts of things around us. But actually, despite these billions of devices, Those trillions of dollars that have been forecasted over the past, 5-10 years have not come to pass. Cisco estimates that only about 26% of IoT projects actually go into full-scale deployment. There's still a major gap between the projections of adoption, the projections of revenue across every industry, even in the smart home, even with our beloved Amazon Echoes or Google Homes. Adoption is still roughly 12 to 14% in the United States, still quite low. Companies have been struggling to monetize IoT devices. This shift from a product-based business model to a services or data-driven business model is not easy, especially for legacy manufacturers. Where value in an economy is less around, tangible material and more around information and data and context flowing off of those objects. That's been very difficult for companies to actually monetize, and no part because forging partnerships and integrations and creating these, quote, ecosystem-based business models is very difficult. It requires a tremendous amount of overhead and contract negotiation, and is sort of one by one, unless you are a giant, a technology giant. Meanwhile, there's a tremendous amount of security issues. We're probably all familiar with everything from, smart home baby monitors being hacked to Mirai botnets, even to, ransomware attacks that have taken down entire hospital networks. These are extremely serious and only getting more daunting and insidious as these technologies and artificial intelligence begin to penetrate the tools of hackers themselves. In an IoT landscape, it is inherently a heterogeneous landscape. In other words, there are many different manufacturers, there are many different types of devices, there are many different pressures of the physical world. For example, in a smart home, there are different devices that emit different levels of data that have different bandwidth capabilities, compute capabilities. Some data is extremely sensitive. Some data is not. Take this same heterogeneous environment and look at a smart city context or an agricultural context. So when we put devices into the physical world, they inherently kind of take on the laws of nature, the laws of the physical world. And this, in many ways, makes distributed machines not so well suited for centralization and centralized models. So we see that as kind of a complementary element, given especially the current monetary struggles that we've seen in the IoT space as inherently complementary to a decentralized or distributed technology like blockchain. So another element that we analyzed in this was the product life cycle. And, every product actually has a very rich life cycle, whether it's connected or not. It has many different companies associated with its development, especially in an IoT context, potentially many different other devices that it's interacting with, many different people moving it along a supply chain or even interacting with it over the course of its use or performance. Things like cars, for example, have first life, second life, third life. And also many different data sets. Increasingly, as devices become interoperable through APIs, through security patches, through software updates, devices themselves have these incredibly rich life cycles, but we don't really have a way to track that information, to authenticate all of those various interactors, if you like, with single products. And so again, this lends IoT and kind of the device life cycle to a shared ledger, a shared way of tracking and authenticating information. So we identified 3 core use cases for this technology, and we abstracted this above any single product. So that's why you see this on the screen here of any product's identity, any product's interactions, and then any product's transactions taking place between products. So I'll briefly go through kind of how we define this looking at a blockchain and give a couple quick examples. Product identity is an immutable way to authenticate the who, what, or origin of a product and its components. Now, we have some proxies for this today. We have a SKU, for example, or some of you may be familiar with a digital twin, a software representation, software-based dynamic representation of a physical object. But we don't have a way to share information about a product's identity across many different parties, especially in a way that's agile. A great example of this is a project called CarPass, which is putting information and documentation about a car, many different cars, onto a distributed ledger. This project, I think, has 6 or 7 different automotive manufacturers and blockchain database companies working on it today, starting with paper documents. A lot of these, remember, are still quite analog. If you bought a car recently, you probably had a file or a folder full of things like the car's title or its maintenance or inspection history or all of these kind of documents that follow a single car around. The next phase of this project is to put telematics data, sensor data, environmental data, really when you think about it, an incredibly rich and unique data set that every single car has about its existence into a shared ledger. I'm going to pause on that and come back to it to better illustrate the interaction side of this. Product interactions are another use case that we see when we combine sensor data, IoT devices with distributed ledger technology. And this is about creating an immutable way to centralize interactions, events, and updates associated with a product. So sticking with that car example for a second, think about who has access to maybe not every single piece of information, but shared access to the identity of a car, both at the individual level as well as an aggregate. Think about how that impacts consumers. Knowing, for example, that a car is not a lemon, being able to see quite clearly the actual wear and tear of a car. For manufacturers, visibility across the supply chain to optimize components and labor sourcing, or rather component sourcing across the entire chain of that, even down to the individual level. There are thousands of different parts that go into a single vehicle. From a dealership standpoint, service centers constantly looking for ways to add value-added service. Think about, what this means for predictive maintenance and also having a much more agile way to pull in advertisers, to pull in insurance companies, pull in financial services providers to fund those. Same is true for technicians, being able to see the actual maintenance history of the car over the course of its lifetime. A couple examples from an aggregate level, think about for municipalities, for certification agencies, for governments and auditors to be able to see wear and tear on roads and infrastructure, environmental emissions impacts, actual car safety audits around that. Having this information effectively as a dashboard, and then again, permission based on who has access to it. This is something that we don't really have today in the IoT space. While this data may exist, it's incredibly siloed. It either is in a database belonging to the manufacturer, or the insurance company may have a slice of it, a dealership may have a slice of it. We don't today have a shared mechanism to authenticate and to permission and share different data around the identity or the interactions associated with products. This becomes incredibly important from the business model standpoint because, again, today, companies to forge partnerships, to forge these service-driven business models where multiple companies can look at the same context around a product and then build new services off of that. This is a very cumbersome build today. Companies themselves are generally low trusting unless they have existing partnerships in other realms. So to forge out these system-based or ecosystem-based business models that IoT has been promising is very, very slow and requires a tremendous amount of overhead and investment and systems integration already against a backdrop of low trust. So we see this interactions element as being a critical enabler, catalyst to building out those business models that actually can take advantage, finally, of the contextual data flowing from devices. Finally, briefly, product transactions, the third way, an immutable and secured way to authenticate and automate the exchange and settlement of a currency-based or tokenized asset. Now, when cars or any device for that matter become wallets and can actually exchange currencies, that will also provide a tremendous amount of liquidity and fluidity across transactions. Cars, for example, simply paying through tolls as they go through them, not running on existing rails. That said, we're probably a little bit further out from that today, and that it obviously requires a tremendous amount of regulatory oversight and shifts from our current modes of operating using existing payment rails and financial institutions. That said, another example of transactions that we're seeing that, again, is critical to the machine-to-machine side is on energy transactions. So actually, transmitting and distributing energy across a grid of solar panels, for example. There's some interesting examples and experiments running around using solar panels to transmit data and electricity on a blockchain. As well as there's a great example out of Germany called Share and Charge, which has put thousands of electric vehicle charging stations owned by both German residents as well as municipality utilities providers into a shared ledger to offer them a much more agile way to access, EV charging stations if you're an owner of an electric vehicle. And sort of like an Airbnb for electric vehicle charging, this serves as a much more agile way to utilize underutilized assets. So this is an incredibly exciting, interesting way that we're seeing electricity actually serve in this sort of transactionary role between different devices. And we're seeing examples of this at the car level, across many different mobility examples, even bikes and scooters, potentially wearables as well. We all have assets that we individuals, as well as businesses, buildings, as well as municipalities, cities, all have assets that could potentially serve as energy emitting or otherwise transacting vehicles or vectors, if you like. So I'll pause there, but this is really the broad opportunity that we're seeing around blockchain. We don't today have, around blockchain and IoT coming together, we don't today have a shared architecture to interconnect, never mind authenticate or really monetize distributed machines. So I want to turn it over back to the panelists and kind of think about, from an IoT perspective, where you're seeing increased trust, reduced costs, accelerated transactions. Where have you seen or do you see real business impacts from this convergence coming together?
Jessica, this is Jonathan, and that's a great and interesting question. And in my view, IoT, or Internet of Things, is more about allowing things to interact with other things than it is allowing people to interact with things. We interact with things all the time anyway. I can go to the grocery store and shop and check out and never interact with a person, only interact with things. Where I see blockchain-based IoT adding value is allowing real-time, trusted transfer of IoT-sized data, and I mean really micro data, and value without requiring trusted intermediaries, where machines can have micro data going back and forth with it's redundant, very small micro payments. And I think that is, we are on the cusp, if not already seeing that. And Medici Ventures has a portfolio company in Belgium called Settlement that is providing a tokenized blockchain system called the Data Broker DAO that allows machines to transfer data and transfer value or payment through its blockchain-based system. And I think that's where IoT meets blockchain first of all.
Yep, that's fascinating.
Yeah, hi, this is Bob. Great topic. So the way we look at it at Luna DNA is that individuals really are concerned about privacy and security and control of their information. And the more we can address those concerns, the more information they will allow to flow, and initially to flow to themselves. And so when we think of IoT devices, we also think of wearables and biometric devices, maybe information from apps that track your exercise and diet. And we want more and more people to use that information and to gather it as well as their health and medical information, so that when they go into a physician, for instance, they have information about themselves that can help drive their care. And this helps them really own their health care. In today's world, honestly, we are owned by the healthcare system, so it does turn things on its head. But additionally, this information has greater value when brought together. So from a big data perspective, if we can figure out a way to use this information at a macro or population level to understand how our genome or how our behaviors and decisions affect our health, then we can improve our quality of life. It's already happening today for simpler links and more direct links, but the more information we gather, the more we learn about these aspects of our diet, our exercise, our genome, and our predisposition to disease, the more we can make decisions that improve our health and frankly, our quality of life. And I say that because I'm referring in some sense to chronic diseases, migraines, fibromyalgia, depression, but also to how our quality of life may change as we get older. So this information is hugely valuable today, but I think it's even more valuable in the future.
I love that example because it really illustrates the difference of where we are today versus what at least this technology could enable. Generally speaking, when I think about the real value of this technology around building trust, reducing costs, and accelerating transactions, we're in this paradigm today of data hoarding in effect. It makes sense as companies, have been, just in the last 20 years, digitizing, going through these digital transformation efforts, bringing things online, making sense of data or trying. And so this culture is really around proprietary, walled off gardens, sort of hoarding as much data as possible. And, just in the last 5 years or so, we've seen a shift of opening up, a fair amount of activity, for example, using APIs, opening up data sets in certain contexts, especially in like a smart city, for example, as well as in the AI space, for example. Some of you may be familiar with, opening up of entire frameworks or giving away tool sets, which I think is fascinating. But generally, this shift from closed to open around data, because we're going through this slow and painful realization that data is actually more valuable when it's opened up, but the trick is how to best secure it and how to still maintain control and security and privacy where it's absolutely essential to. And that kind of broad shift of from data hoarding to, the more of our own data we have, the better, to this more data sharing with proper controls and security in place, where instead of, single large entities pushing APIs out, imagine a world of individuals, in the case of healthcare, for example, or even advertising, use of our brand engagement, individuals sort of owning their own APIs, to use that same structure, cities offering APIs, devices themselves, businesses themselves, where it becomes this network of everyone sort of acts as a node, an agent, in order to bring about innovation. And, the healthcare space is a perfect example of, Bob, as you mentioned, the individual's control then lending back to, in aggregate, increasing quality of health, increasing quality of, medical research and disease and quality of life. The same can be applied to innovations at the business level, optimization across different industries, supply chain, for instance. The same is true at the environmental level, and what many smart cities are focused on. The more information that can be used across so many different entities or nodes, to use blockchain speak, the more opening and shared value, I think, is really where this is the painful process that this technology is starting to push us toward. But it's not alone. I mean, the idea of big data has been pushing companies in this direction for years at this point. We've already talked through a little bit of this, of just this trust at the product level, whether we're talking about IoT products or even individuals, or even single businesses, is what really enables trust across an ecosystem of untrusting constituents. In the example of the EV charging stations in Germany, think about the difference between trust of German residents when they're able to actually monetize their EV charging stations versus when they're simply relying on the local municipality or rather utilities provider to offer that. Sort of bringing an entire ecosystem into this shared economy really changes how they trust each other. And this is, of course, true at the device level as well. Let me pause because it's a good time to revisit our poll. We've had a number of votes come in. I personally am surprised. I'm curious feedback of the poll. So we asked, when do you think blockchain will become mainstream? 68% of you said it is already becoming mainstream. The second bucket was I'm not sure at 20%, and third bucket at 10% was I've heard of it in the news, but I'm not sure how it applies to business. And 0% said I don't even know what blockchain is. 68%, almost 70%, 7 out of 10 saying that blockchain is already mainstream. Panelists, what do you think?
Hi, this is Bob. I think the technology, if you watch it, goes through an exponential curve, and it moves forward in a pace that initially seems slow, but it's still exponential. But at some point, those doublings start to become very obvious. But what happens with perception of technology is, first, there's sort of an over-exuberance when we hear about technologies, but because they get adopted on an exponential curve, and 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, we don't see it moving so quickly, and then there's a little bit of disenchantment. But we get to a point where it really blows up, and, if you ever think about sort of doubling a penny over a month and ending up with $1 million, you can go through that analogy. So I think blockchain is coming. It's following this exponential curve. I honestly don't know what the definition of mainstream is, but people of all ages are accessing it, and it's democratized, so it doesn't really matter what your background is or where you live in the world. It's gaining grassroots followers.
Yep.
Jessica, as enthusiastic as I am about blockchain, I don't think I would yet describe it as mainstream. I think we're on the beginning of what I think will be a steep adoption curve. And it is being used. We see people spending cryptocurrency on overstock.com. We see votes being cast in elections with blockchain technology. West Virginia is using it for its absentee ballots during this election cycle. I think it's beginning, but whether it's a year from now or 2 years from now, we'll know when it's mainstream. When we aren't talking about it, we're just using it.
Right. That's usually what happens when technologies actually work. They go invisible. I tend to agree with you. I think it's extremely early days, and although we are hearing about it in the media, and Bitcoin enjoyed a popularity and value surge at the end of 2017, it's extremely early days, particularly from the enterprise perspective. I can't tell you how many times, I'm talking to companies about it, and, really it's like, we really don't know anything about it. Never mind the inherent challenges of, as I mentioned earlier, working together, getting extremely intimate in the actual coding and development and contracts, and encoding those contracts without much regulatory precedent in many, many cases across multiple businesses. This will not happen overnight, really, in any industry. I want to open up this broader question of some of the bigger challenges and hindrances that you all have experienced or seen with your investments or customers, as the case may be, around this technology. What are the biggest challenges that you see that businesses should really be thinking about when pursuing this kind of innovation?
So I think I would list 3 big challenges for blockchain today. First is good enterprise level software developers. We're in a new field of technology. Good developers are hard to find anywhere, but they're particularly hard to find in the blockchain space. The second challenge or potential hindrance is regulation. I am always concerned when Congress or state legislators get a whiff of blockchain and think, now it is in my domain to regulate. I think legislators in Congress would do well to do what Congress did back in the early 90s when the internet was nascent and beginning, and said, we're going to let this grow free and unfettered from government regulation. Technology shouldn't be regulated. Perhaps its uses should, but not the technology itself. And then the third, I think, hurdle that blockchain has is many of its use cases require network effects. If you're using it as a payment mechanism, consumers need to want to use it, and merchants need to take it. That network effect, I think, will bloom quickly, but it's certainly something that's very real in the blockchain space.
Yeah, that's a great point. Bob, what are you seeing in terms of primary challenges?
Yeah, great comments, Jonathan. And I was going to mention a couple of those, so I'll be a little shorter. One of them is capacity today in terms of, if many businesses went into the blockchain, there's a question of whether there's enough capacity today, and people are working on that. So I think that's just a typical problem with the new technology. Another is speed. Ethereum and its blockchain is probably 10 plus times faster than Bitcoin and its blockchain in terms of processing information. And it still needs to be sped up. And so I think that I would go with capacity and speed as two things that we need to watch for as the use of the blockchain grows, and just to make sure we understand those limitations and the impact on our business. The other dimension, I think, is really understanding why we are using the blockchain. And a question is are we using the blockchain because people think it's a good idea, because there's hype around the blockchain, or do we really understand our business and the value we expect to receive by using the blockchain versus more traditional technologies? If you understand that question well, you'll make high-quality decisions, and you'll design your software and your business model regarding the use of the blockchain in a way to maximize that value.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think especially with new technologies, a lot of times in certain organizations, the culture is we should just lean into it to do something around it, to, release a press release if nothing else. And that is really not a constructive way to look at or think about this technology. Again, experimentation in a vacuum is not recommended. It does take, to your point, Jonathan, about the network effects, it does take a village, and not only a village to design and to build and regulate, but also a village of users. It's inherently network technology. And even from that standpoint, some of the cultural barriers of, very often, at the enterprise decision maker level, I'm constantly asked the question of, but who is responsible if something goes wrong? And so it's sort of disassociating our centralized ways of thinking and our centralized processes from experimenting with this technology in and of itself is a huge barrier. Just the cultural biases, because this is the way society exists, to rethink how processes run and to rethink how transactions are done is in and of itself a huge hurdle. Never mind just education. I also think that this technology sort of reframes or realigns value constructs. Who controls data? What are the incentives around that data, both sharing and emitting or generating? As well as what relationships look like in an internet age. And so I think these are all big, huge cultural questions that will take time at all levels, not just with businesses, but individuals as well. To that end, and we just have about a couple more minutes, but I wanted to ask the panel one more question, and in the meantime, please invite the audience to ask your questions. We're going to turn it over to Q&A in just a moment. But before we sign off on these questions, what advice or recommendations would you offer companies interested in developing blockchain-based programs? Bob?
Yeah, so I will build on what I mentioned earlier. So in terms of a challenge of implementing blockchain, I talked about making sure how it creates value in our business. But in terms of a recommendation on how we might think about it, I like to step back at least once a year and go away and look at the future 5 or 8 years out, given that I've always been in fields that move forward exponentially, and try to envision sort of what the market looks like, what the technology might enable in the future. And so the recommendation I would provide is to basically take that step back, look at the future, and ask yourself, if you had blockchain, if you had cryptocurrency, and if you had IoT, what might your business look like? How would it be different than it is today? And how do you reinvent yourself based on these technologies and other technologies in order to get there? And I think that's an appropriate timeline to think about, given that implementation is not instantaneous anyway.
Boy, those are great comments, Bob, and I echo them. I really think looking at what's the value of blockchain to your business? Are you using it as an excuse because it's a buzzword? I think of the Long Island Tea Company renaming itself as the Long Island Blockchain Tea Company or whatever it was. I just think there's no blockchain business there. And then what does implementation look like? Bob talked about speed, and there is no perfect blockchain technology yet. Some are faster, some are more decentralized. I really think you have to look, do you want to be part of what's known as a private blockchain where the ledgers are distributed amongst a number of people, or do you want to be part of a public blockchain that's more decentralized and I think closer to that freedom and liberty that the original blockchain enthusiasts envisioned? And then the last thing I would say is, are you using your industry expertise to advance blockchain? There are a lot of people who like to talk about blockchain solutions but have no industry expertise to really use it. And so that's something important to factor into it.
But those are really good, I think, actionable ways of thinking about it. I'm going to turn it back to you, Rachel, as we tee up some of the questions that you all have submitted in the Q&A. So back to you.
Thanks, guys. This has been such an amazing discussion. I think we could have a whole other hour on this. So we've gotten some wonderful audience questions, and audience, go ahead and keep submitting those if you'd like. I'm going to start with a more simple one, and for the folks in the audience at varying levels of understanding about blockchain. And this first question I'll send over to you, Bob. The question is there a size of company that should leverage blockchain to see an ROI?
Well, we founded ourselves with 0 employees, so I'm not sure how I would answer the question of size. I think that if you look at your vision and what you want to achieve and you have a business model, I think you can execute that as a startup or you can execute that within a large company. So I don't think size is a determinant. I think it really has to do with where do you want to go. Technologies are basically tools that enable you, and you pull tools out of a toolbox when you need a tool. New technologies allow you to do things you couldn't do because you can envision how this new tool allows you to do things differently. I don't see size as necessarily a factor in that as long as you plan accordingly. So hopefully I answered the question. I know that I probably took a little bit of a turn in my answer.
If I could add just a thought, Rachel, I think
please.
I think we're going through a technology revolution with blockchain like we did with the internet or even the industrial revolution. And I think bigger companies have more bureaucracy and it's difficult to put this through. I actually think smaller companies will be more nimble in displacing bigger companies through blockchain technology. So if I were a big incumbent, I would be looking at this hard because I think it's small companies that are going to have more advantage from leveraging blockchain technology quickly.
How about you, Jessica? Anything to add?
Completely agree. I mean, certainly the tools and the tool sets out there are for anyone and everyone. And one of the fascinating things about this technology is that it's being driven both by large enterprises, global financial institutions and governments on the one side, and individuals and developers and crypto enthusiasts on the other side. And so there are tool sets and capabilities for all of the above. So the barrier to entry, aside from the education, is there and available.
And scalable, it sounds like.
Scalable.
So next question, very, very good question, and I'll start with you on this one, Jonathan. It's kind of long. It says, if I have heaps of sensors and sensor data, would the blockchain allow for not only these devices, but for existing systems that use that data? Would they require a rewrite of existing code, or would you need to use it as an API? I realize that's pretty technical. So Jessica, you can jump in here too. But Jonathan, do you have anything to say on this one?
Oh, yes, I do. The answer to the question that would blockchain allow for those devices on an existing system is yes, it certainly would. Do you need to rewrite code or have an API? I think that's going to be one of the tricks of adoption, is finding that middleware that makes it easy for the current systems to hook into the blockchain. And it's one of the reasons that we have a portfolio company in Belgium called Settlement. Their middleware solution allows data under a current set through middleware and APIs to be put easily on the blockchain. So that exists, and I think it will exist more in the future.
Bob, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think whenever we sort of connect things together, connecting computers together on the internet, for instance, or other devices, initially there's a lot of issues with standardization and trying to eliminate multiple standards and get to a single standard. And there's also an issue with sort of complexity in communication. But over time, we adopt standards, and over time, we write software that abstracts out the complexity, even the complexity of hooking things together from legacy systems. So I do think that is an issue today, but over time, that issue will start to be less and less onerous in trying to even connect legacy devices.
Excellent. And Jessica, we have a couple minutes left. Do you have anything to add on this one?
Yeah, I mean, a broader comment that, this won't be a kind of on-off switch. And existing architectures, existing, structures and standards and data sets aren't becoming irrelevant to blockchain implementations. In fact, they probably define what these implementations and architectures are going to look like. These are hybrid architectures. We're not switching over to something entirely new and rewriting. In fact, this is a core focus of many different industry consortia out there, and there are, I think, a few around IoT and blockchain in particular, where they're really thinking about these standardizations and how to create test beds and sort of sandboxes to test any and all infrastructures, integrations between them, interoperability between them, because that's a fundamental issue, and still a current issue in the IoT space. So this one won't be switching over to anything as much as it will be more of a hybrid approach. Hopefully that helps.
I have probably room for one more question if each of you, this is fun, could take like 30 seconds to answer, or whoever wants to answer it. So this is, do you think most companies create their own blockchain, or are they going to use existing ones like IOTA, Ethereum, and NEM? Jessica, do you want to start us off on this one?
I'm seeing things in many directions. I think predominantly companies are looking at blockchains that are out there, and given the issues around standardization, and as well as having multiple constituencies working on and agreeing on an architecture, this would be the recommended approach, to look at solutions that are existing rather than creating your own. But it will also depend. There is no one kind of blockchain. I think what we'll see in a nearer term are, industry-specific, but in certain cases, use case-specific blockchains, or distributed ledger kind of examples, and as well as, many that are designed for, certain applications in financial services or certain applications in supply chain. or certain applications in transportation. I think we'll kind of see more vertical level than hopefully not a proliferation of custom blockchains.
Sorry, guys, we are out of time. This has been such a wonderful conversation. And audience, on behalf of our guests, we'd love to thank you for attending and remind you that our speakers today were Jonathan Johnson of Overstock.com, Bob Kane from Luna DNA, and Jessica Grootman from Kaleido Insights. Reminder that you'll also be able to listen to the recording of this webinar in the next 30 minutes or so using the same link. And don't forget, if you enjoyed today's event or have suggestions for how we can make it better, we'd love for you to give us a rating. I'm Rachel Brownell, signing off for VentureBeat. This webcast is copyright 2018 by VentureBeat. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by VentureBeat, who's responsible for its content, and the individual speakers are responsible for their content. Thanks for your time and have a great day.